Hello, and welcome to Wiki-On-Tape. Today, I will be reading about Leon Trotsky. This recording was made on Thursday, September 24, 2020 by Wiki-On-Tape v1.2.0. Let's get started. Summary. Lev Davidovich Bronstein, better known as Leon Trotsky, was a Russian revolutionary, political theorist and politician. Ideologically a communist, he developed a variant of Marxism known as Trotskyism. Trotsky joined the Bolshevik Party a few weeks before the October Revolution and became one of the leaders of the party. Once in government, Trotsky initially held the post of the Commissar for Foreign Affairs and was involved in the Brest-Litovsk negotiations with Germany as Russia pulled out of World War I. Trotsky became more prominent from March 1918 to January 1925 as the leader of the Red Army in the post of Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs. Trotsky was a vital leading figure in the Red victory in the Russian Civil War. He was one of the 7 members of the First Politburo. After the rise of Joseph Stalin, Trotsky was removed from his positions and eventually expelled from the Soviet Union in February 1929. He spent the rest of his life in exile and was assassinated in 1940 in Mexico City by Ramon Mercader, a Soviet NKVD agent. Trotsky was openly critical of Stalinism. He was written out of the history books under Stalin and was one of the few Soviet political personalities who was not rehabilitated by the Soviet administration under Nikita Khrushchev in the 1950s. Childhood and family. Leon Trotsky was born Lev Davidovich Bronstein to David Leontievich Bronstein and Anna Lvovna on 7 November 1879, the fifth child of a Ukrainian Jewish family of wealthy farmers in Yanovka or Yanivka, in the Kherson Governorate of the Russian Empire, a small village 24 kilometers from the nearest post office. His father, David Leontievich, had lived in Poltava, and later moved to Berezovka, as it had a large Jewish community. The language spoken at home was a mixture of Russian and Ukrainian. Trotsky's younger sister, Olga, who also grew up to be a Bolshevik and a Soviet politician, married the prominent Bolshevik Lev Kamenev. Some authors, notably Robert Service, have claimed that Trotsky's childhood first name was the Yiddish Leba. The American Trotskyist David North said that this was an assumption based on Trotsky's Jewish birth, but, contrary to Service's claims, there is no documentary evidence to support his using a Yiddish name, when that language was not spoken by his family. Both North and political historian Walter Lacker wrote that Trotsky's childhood name was Lova, a standard Russian diminutive of the name Lev. North has compared the speculation on Trotsky's given name to the undue emphasis given to his having a Jewish surname. When Trotsky was 8, his father sent him to Odessa to be educated. He was enrolled in a German-language school, which became Russified during his years in Odessa as a result of the imperial government's policy of Russification. As Isaac Deutscher notes in his biography of Trotsky, Odessa was then a bustling cosmopolitan port city, very unlike the typical Russian city of the time. This environment contributed to the development of the young man's international outlook. Although Trotsky spoke French, English, and German to a good standard, he said in his autobiography My Life that he was never perfectly fluent in any language but Russian and Ukrainian. Raymond Molinier wrote that Trotsky spoke French fluently. Revolutionary activity and imprisonment. Trotsky became involved in revolutionary activities in 1896 after moving to the harbor town of Nikolaev on the Ukrainian coast of the Black Sea. At first a Narodnik, he initially opposed Marxism but was won over to Marxism later that year by his future first wife, Alexandra Sokolovskaya. Instead of pursuing a mathematics degree, Trotsky helped organize the South Russian Workers' Union in Nikolaev in early 1897. Using the name, Lvov, he wrote and printed leaflets and proclamations, distributed revolutionary pamphlets, and popularized socialist ideas among industrial workers and revolutionary students. In January 1898, more than 200 members of the Union, including Trotsky, were arrested. He was held for the next 2 years in prison waiting trial, first in Nikolaev, then Kherson, then Odessa, and finally in Moscow. In the Moscow prison, he came into contact with other revolutionaries, heard about Lenin and read Lenin's book, The Development of Capitalism in Russia. 2 months into his imprisonment, on 1 to 3 March 1898, the first Congress of the newly formed Russian Social Democratic Labour Party was held. From then on, Trotsky identified as a member of the party. First marriage and Siberian exile. While in the prison in Moscow, in the summer of 1899, Trotsky married Alexandra Sokolovskaya, a fellow Marxist. The wedding ceremony was performed by a Jewish chaplain. In 1900, he was sentenced to 4 years in exile in Siberia. Because of their marriage, Trotsky and his wife were allowed to be exiled to the same location in Siberia. They were exiled to Ust-Kut and the Verkholensk in the Baikal Lake region of Siberia. They had 2 daughters, Zinaida and Nina, both born in Siberia. In Siberia, Trotsky studied philosophy. He became aware of the differences within the party, which had been decimated by arrests in 1898 and 1899. Some social democrats known as economists argued that the party should focus on helping industrial workers improve their lot in life and were not so worried about changing the government. They believed that societal reforms would grow out of the workers' struggle for higher pay and better working conditions. Others argued that overthrowing the monarchy was more important and that a well-organized and disciplined revolutionary party was essential. The latter position was expressed by the London-based newspaper Iskra, which was founded in 1900. Trotsky quickly sided with the Iskra position and began writing for the paper. In the summer of 1902, at the urging of his wife Alexandra, Trotsky escaped from Siberia hidden in a load of hay on a wagon. Alexandra later escaped from Siberia with their daughters. Both daughters married, and Zinaida had children, but the daughters died before their parents. Nina Nevelson died from tuberculosis in 1928, cared for in her last months by her older sister. Zinaida Volkova followed her father into exile in Berlin, taking her son by her second marriage but leaving behind a daughter in Russia. Suffering also from tuberculosis and depression, Zinaida committed suicide in 1933. Alexandra disappeared in 1935 during the Great Purges in the Soviet Union under Stalin and was murdered by Stalinist forces 3 years later. First emigration and second marriage. Until this point in his life, Trotsky had used his birth name, Lev Bronstein. He changed his surname to Trotsky, the name he would use for the rest of his life. It is said he adopted the name of a jailer of the Odessa prison in which he had earlier been held. This became his primary revolutionary pseudonym. After his escape from Siberia, Trotsky moved to London, joining Georgy Plekhanov, Vladimir Lenin, Julius Martov and other editors of Iskra. Under the pen name Puro, Trotsky soon became one of the paper's leading writers. Unknown to Trotsky, the 6 editors of Iskra were evenly split between the «Old Guard», led by Plekhanov, and the «New Guard», led by Lenin and Martov. Plekhanov's supporters were older, and had spent the previous 20 years together in exile in Europe. Members of the New Guard were in their early 30s and had only recently emigrated from Russia. Lenin, who was trying to establish a permanent majority against Plekhanov within Iskra, expected Trotsky, then 23, to side with the New Guard. In March 1903 Lenin wrote, "I suggest to all the members of the editorial board that they co-opt Puro as a member of the board on the same basis as other members. Opening square bracket ... closing square bracket. We very much need a 7th member, both as a convenience in voting and as an addition to our forces. Puro has been contributing to every issue for several months now. He works, in general, most energetically for the Iskra. He gives lectures. In the section of articles and notes on the events of the day, he will not only be very useful, but absolutely necessary. Unquestionably a man of rare abilities, he has conviction and energy, and he will go much farther." Because of Plekhanov's opposition, Trotsky did not become a full member of the board. But from then on, he participated in its meetings in an advisory capacity, which earned him Plekhanov's enmity. In late 1902, Trotsky met Natalia Sadova, who soon became his companion. They married in 1903, and she was with him until his death. They had 2 children together, Lev Sadov and Sergei Sadov, both of whom would predecease their parents. Regarding his son's surnames, Trotsky later explained that after the 1917 revolution, "In order not to oblige my sons to change their name, I, for citizenship requirements, took on the name of my wife." Trotsky never used the name Sadov, either privately or publicly. Natalia Sadova sometimes signed her name, Sadova Trotskaya. Split with Lenin. In the meantime, after a period of secret police repression and internal confusion that followed the First Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in 1898, Iskra succeeded in convening the party's Second Congress in London in August 1903. Trotsky and other Iskra editors attended. The First Congress went as planned, with Iskra supporters handily defeating the few, economist delegates. Then the Congress discussed the position of the Jewish Bund, which had co-founded the RSDLP in 1898 but wanted to remain autonomous within the party. Shortly after that, the pro-Iskra delegates split into two factions. Lenin and his supporters, the Bolsheviks, argued for a smaller but highly organized party, while Martov and his supporters, the Mensheviks, argued for a more massive and less disciplined party. In a surprise development, Trotsky and most of the Iskra editors supported Martov and the Mensheviks, while Plekhanov supported Lenin and the Bolsheviks. During 1903 and 1904, many members changed sides in the factions. Plekhanov soon parted ways with the Bolsheviks. Trotsky left the Mensheviks in September 1904 over their insistence on an alliance with Russian liberals and their opposition to a reconciliation with Lenin and the Bolsheviks. From 1904 until 1917, Trotsky described himself as a non-factional social democrat. He worked between 1904 and 1917, trying to reconcile different groups within the party, which resulted in many clashes with Lenin and other prominent party members. Trotsky later maintained that he had been wrong in opposing Lenin on the issue of the party. During these years, Trotsky began developing his theory of permanent revolution and developed a close working relationship with Alexander Parvus in 1904–07. During their split, Lenin referred to Trotsky as a Judas, a scoundrel, and a swine. 1905 Revolution and trial. The unrest and agitation against the Russian government came to a head in St. Petersburg on 3 January 1905, when a strike broke out at the Putilov works in the city. This single strike grew into a general strike, and by 7 January 1905, there were 140,000 strikers in St. Petersburg. On Sunday 9 January 1905, Father Georgy Gapon led a peaceful procession of citizens through the streets to the Winter Palace to beseech the Tsar for food and relief from the oppressive government. The palace guard fired on the peaceful demonstration, resulting in the deaths of some 1,000 demonstrators. Sunday 9 January 1905, became known as Bloody Sunday. Following the events of Bloody Sunday, Trotsky secretly returned to Russia in February 1905, by way of Kiev. At first he wrote leaflets for an underground printing press in Kiev, but soon moved to the capital, St. Petersburg. There he worked with both Bolsheviks, such as Central Committee member Leonid Krazin, and the local Menshevik committee, which he pushed in a more radical direction. The latter, however, were betrayed by a secret police agent in May, and Trotsky had to flee to rural Finland. There he worked on fleshing out his theory of permanent revolution. On 19 September 1905, the typesetters at the Ivan Saitin's printing house in Moscow went out on strike for shorter hours and higher pay. By the evening of 24 September, the workers at 50 other printing shops in Moscow were also on strike. On 2 October 1905, the typesetters in printing shops in St. Petersburg decided to strike in support of the Moscow strikers. On 7 October 1905, the railway workers of the Moscow-Kazan Railway went out on strike. Amid the resulting confusion, Trotsky returned from Finland to St. Petersburg on 15 October 1905. On that day, Trotsky spoke before the St. Petersburg Soviet Council of Workers' Deputies, which was meeting at the Technological Institute in the city. Also attending were some 200,000 people crowded outside to hear the speeches, about half of all workers in St. Petersburg. After his return, Trotsky and Parvus took over the newspaper Russian Gazette, increasing its circulation to 500,000. Trotsky also co-founded, together with Parvus and Julius Martov and other Mensheviks, Nashalo, which also proved to be a very successful newspaper in the revolutionary atmosphere of St. Petersburg in 1905. Just before Trotsky's return, the Mensheviks had independently come up with the same idea that Trotsky had, an elected non-party revolutionary organization representing the capital's workers, the First Soviet of Workers. By the time of Trotsky's arrival, the St. Petersburg Soviet was already functioning headed by Krustalov-Nassar. Krustalov-Nassar had been a compromise figure when elected as the head of the St. Petersburg Soviet. Krustalov-Nassar was a lawyer that stood above the political factions contained in the Soviet. However, since his election, he proved to be very popular with the workers in spite of the Bolsheviks' original opposition to him. Krustalov-Nassar became famous in his position as spokesman for the St. Petersburg Soviet. Indeed, to the outside world, Krustalov-Nassar was the embodiment of the St. Petersburg Soviet. Trotsky joined the Soviet under the name, Yanovsky, and was elected vice-chairman. He did much of the actual work at the Soviet and, after Krustalov-Nassar's arrest on 26 November 1905, was elected its chairman. On 2 December, the Soviet issued a proclamation which included the following statement about the Tsarist government and its foreign debts: "The autocracy never enjoyed the confidence of the people and was never granted any authority by the people. We have therefore decided not to allow the repayment of such loans as have been made by the Tsarist government when openly engaged in a war with the entire people." The following day, the Soviet was surrounded by troops loyal to the government and the deputies were arrested. Trotsky and other Soviet leaders were tried in 1906 on charges of supporting an armed rebellion. On 4 October 1906 he was convicted and sentenced to internal exile to Siberia. Second emigration. While en route to exile in Obdorsk, Siberia, in January 1907, Trotsky escaped at Berezov and once again made his way to London. He attended the Fifth Congress of the RSDLP. In October, he moved to Vienna, Austria-Hungary. For the next 7 years, he often took part in the activities of the Austrian Social Democratic Party and, occasionally, of the German Social Democratic Party. In Vienna, Trotsky became close to Adolf Joffe, his friend for the next 20 years, who introduced him to psychoanalysis. In October 1908 he was asked to join the editorial staff of Pravda, a biweekly, Russian-language social democratic paper for Russian workers, which he co-edited with Adolf Joffe and Matvey Skobelev. It was smuggled into Russia. The paper appeared very irregularly, only 5 issues were published in its first year. Avoiding factional politics, the paper proved popular with Russian industrial workers. Both the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks split multiple times after the failure of the 1905–1907 revolution. Money was very scarce for the publication of Pravda. Trotsky approached the Russian Central Committee to seek financial backing for the newspaper throughout 1909. A majority of Bolsheviks controlled the Central Committee in 1910. Lenin agreed to the financing of Pravda, but required a Bolshevik to be appointed as co-editor of the paper. When various Bolshevik and Menshevik factions tried to reunite at the January 1910 RSDLP Central Committee meeting in Paris over Lenin's objections, Trotsky's Pravda was made a party-financed, central organ. Lev Kamenev, Trotsky's brother-in-law, was added to the editorial board from the Bolsheviks, but the unification attempts failed in August 1910. Kamenev resigned from the board amid mutual recriminations. Trotsky continued publishing Pravda for another 2 years until it finally folded in April 1912. The Bolsheviks started a new workers-oriented newspaper in St. Petersburg on the 22nd of April 1912 and also called it Pravda. Trotsky was so upset by what he saw as a usurpation of his newspaper's name that in April 1913, he wrote a letter to Nikolai Chikadze, a Menshevik leader, bitterly denouncing Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Though he quickly got over the disagreement, the message was intercepted by the Russian police, and a copy was put into their archives. Shortly after Lenin's death in 1924, the letter was found and publicized by Trotsky's opponents within the Communist Party to portray him as Lenin's enemy. The 1910s was a period of heightened tension within the RSDLP, leading to numerous frictions between Trotsky, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The most serious disagreement that Trotsky and the Mensheviks had with Lenin at the time was over the issue of expropriations, i.e., armed robbery of banks and other companies by Bolshevik groups to procure money for the party. These actions had been banned by the Fifth Congress, but were continued by the Bolsheviks. In January 1912, the majority of the Bolshevik faction, led by Lenin, as well as a few defecting Mensheviks, held a conference in Prague and decided to break away from the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, and formed a new party, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. In response, Trotsky organized a «unification» conference of social democratic factions in Vienna in August 1912 and tried to reunite the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks into one party. The attempt was generally unsuccessful. In Vienna, Trotsky continuously published articles in radical Russian and Ukrainian newspapers, such as Kievskaya Mysl, under a variety of pseudonyms, often using Antid Otto. In September 1912, Kievskaya Mysl sent him to the Balkans as its war correspondent, where he covered the two Balkan Wars for the next year. While there, Trotsky chronicled the ethnic cleansing carried out by the Serbian army against the Albanian civilian population. He became a close friend of Christian Rakovsky, later a leading Soviet politician and Trotsky's ally in the Soviet Communist Party. On 3 August 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, in which Austria-Hungary fought against the Russian Empire, Trotsky was forced to flee Vienna for neutral Switzerland to avoid arrest as a Russian émigré. World War I. The outbreak of World War I caused a sudden realignment within the RSDLP and other European social democratic parties over the issues of war, revolution, pacifism and internationalism. Within the RSDLP, Lenin, Trotsky and Martov advocated various internationalist anti-war positions, while Plekhanov and other social democrats supported the Russian government to some extent. In Switzerland, Trotsky briefly worked within the Swiss Socialist Party, prompting it to adopt an internationalist resolution. He wrote a book opposing the War and the International, and the pro-war position taken by the European social democratic parties, primarily the German Party. As a war correspondent for the Kievskaya Mysl, Trotsky moved to France on 19 November 1914. In January 1915 in Paris, he began editing Nash Slovo, an internationalist socialist newspaper. He adopted the slogan of, "Peace without indemnities or annexations, peace without conquerors or conquered." Lenin advocated Russia's defeat in the war and demanded a complete break with the Second International. Trotsky attended the Zimmerwald Conference of Anti-War Socialists in September 1915 and advocated a middle course between those who, like Martov, would stay within the Second International at any cost and those who, like Lenin, would break with the Second International and form a Third International. The conference adopted the middle line proposed by Trotsky. At first opposed, in the end Lenin voted for Trotsky's resolution to avoid a split among anti-war socialists. On 31 March 1916, Trotsky was deported from France to Spain for his anti-war activities. Spanish authorities did not want him and deported him to the United States on 25 December 1916. He arrived in New York City on 13 January 1917. He stayed for nearly 3 months at 1522 Vice Avenue in the Bronx. In New York he wrote articles for the local Russian-language socialist newspaper, Novy Mir, and the Yiddish-language daily, Der Vorwärts, in translation. He also made speeches to Russian émigrés. Trotsky was living in New York City when the February Revolution of 1917 overthrew Tsar Nicholas II. He left New York on 27 March 1917, but his ship, the SS Christiania Fjord, was intercepted by British naval officials in Canada at Halifax, Nova Scotia. He was detained for a month at Amherst internment camp in Nova Scotia. While imprisoned in the camp, Trotsky established an increasing friendship with the workers and sailors amongst his fellow inmates, describing his month at the camp as one continual mass meeting. Trotsky's speeches and agitation incurred the wrath of German officer inmates who complained to the British camp commander, Colonel Morris, about Trotsky's anti-patriotic attitude. Morris then forbade Trotsky to make any more public speeches, leading to 530 prisoners protesting and signing a petition against Morris's order. Back in Russia, after initial hesitation and facing pressure from the Workers' and Peasants' Soviets, the Russian Foreign Minister Pavel Milukov was compelled to demand the release of Trotsky as a Russian citizen, and the British government freed him on 29 April 1917. He reached Russia on 17 May 1917. After his return, Trotsky substantially agreed with the Bolshevik position, but did not join them right away. Russian Social Democrats were split into at least 6 groups, and the Bolsheviks were waiting for the next party congress to determine which factions to merge with. Trotsky temporarily joined the Mezryantsy, a regional social democratic organization in St. Petersburg, and became one of its leaders. At the First Congress of Soviets in June, he was elected a member of the First All-Russian Central Executive Committee from the Mezryantsy faction. After an unsuccessful pro-Bolshevik uprising in Petrograd, Trotsky was arrested on 7 August 1917. He was released 40 days later in the aftermath of the failed counter-revolutionary uprising by Lavr Kornilov. After the Bolsheviks gained a majority in the Petrograd Soviet, Trotsky was elected chairman on 25 September, OS 8 October 1917. He sided with Lenin against Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev when the Bolshevik Central Committee discussed staging an armed uprising, and he led the efforts to overthrow the provisional government headed by Alexander Kerensky. The following summary of Trotsky's role in 1917 was written by Stalin in Pravda, 6 November 1918. Although this passage was quoted in Stalin's book The October Revolution, it was expunged from Stalin's works. All practical work in connection with the organization of the uprising was done under the immediate direction of Comrade Trotsky, the president of the Petrograd Soviet. It can be stated with certainty that the party is indebted primarily and principally to Comrade Trotsky for the rapid going over of the garrison to the side of the Soviet and the efficient manner in which the work of the Military Revolutionary Committee was organized. After the success of the uprising on 7 to 8 November 1917, Trotsky led the efforts to repel a counterattack by Cossacks under General Pyotr Krasnov and other troops still loyal to the overthrown provisional government at Gatchina. Allied with Lenin, he defeated attempts by other Bolshevik Central Committee members to share power with other socialist parties. By the end of 1917, Trotsky was unquestionably the second man in the Bolshevik Party after Lenin. He overshadowed the ambitious Zinoviev, who had been Lenin's top lieutenant over the previous decade, but whose star appeared to be fading. This reversal of position contributed to continuing competition and enmity between the two men, which lasted until 1926 and did much to destroy them both. Commissar for Foreign Affairs and Brest-Litovsk. After the Bolsheviks came to power, Trotsky became the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs and published the secret treaties previously signed by the Triple Entente that detailed plans for post-war reallocation of colonies and redrawing state borders. Trotsky led the Soviet delegation during the peace negotiations in Brest-Litovsk from the 22nd of December 1917 to the 10th of February 1918. At that time the Soviet government was split on the issue. Left Communists, led by Nikolai Bukharin, continued to believe that there could be no peace between a Soviet republic and a capitalist country and that only a revolutionary war leading to a pan-European Soviet republic would bring a durable peace. They cited the successes of the newly formed Voluntary Red Army against Polish forces of Gen. Józef Dałbor-Musnicki in Belarus, White forces in the Don region, and newly independent Ukrainian forces as proof that the Red Army could repel German forces, especially if propaganda and asymmetrical warfare were used. They were willing to hold talks with the Germans as a means of exposing German imperial ambitions in the hope of accelerating the hoped minus for Soviet revolution in the West. Still, they were dead set against signing any peace treaty. In the case of a German ultimatum, they advocated proclaiming a revolutionary war against Germany to inspire Russian and European workers to fight for socialism. This opinion was shared by left socialist revolutionaries, who were then the Bolsheviks' junior partners in a coalition government. Lenin, who had earlier hoped for a speedy Soviet revolution in Germany and other parts of Europe, quickly decided that the imperial government of Germany was still firmly in control and that, without a strong Russian military, an armed conflict with Germany would lead to a collapse of the Soviet government in Russia. He agreed with the left communists that ultimately a pan-European Soviet revolution would solve all problems, but until then the Bolsheviks had to stay in power. Lenin did not mind prolonging the negotiating process for maximum propaganda effect, but, from January 1918 on, advocated signing a separate peace treaty if faced with a German ultimatum. Trotsky's position was between these two Bolshevik factions. Like Lenin, he admitted that the old Russian military, inherited from the monarchy and the provisional government and in advanced stages of decomposition, was unable to fight. That we could no longer fight was perfectly clear to me, and that the newly formed Red Guard and Red Army detachments were too small and poorly trained to resist the Germans. But he agreed with the left communists that a separate peace treaty with an imperialist power would be a terrible morale and material blow to the Soviet government, negate all its military and political successes of 1917 and 1918, resurrect the notion that the Bolsheviks secretly allied with the German government, and cause an upsurge of internal resistance. He argued that any German ultimatum should be refused, and that this might well lead to an uprising in Germany, or at least inspire German soldiers to disobey their officers, since any German offensive would be a naked grab for territories. Trotsky wrote in 1925, "We began peace negotiations in the hope of arousing the Workmen's Party of Germany and Austria-Hungary as well as of the Entente countries. For this reason we were obliged to delay the negotiations as long as possible to give the European workmen time to understand the main fact of the Soviet Revolution itself and particularly its peace policy. But there was the other question: can the Germans still fight? Are they in a position to begin an attack on the revolution that will explain the cessation of the war? How can we find out the state of mind of the German soldiers, how to fathom it?" Throughout January and February 1918, Lenin's position was supported by 7 members of the Bolshevik Central Committee and Bukharin's by 4. Trotsky had 4 votes and, since he held the balance of power, he was able to pursue his policy in Brest-Litovsk. When he could no longer delay the negotiations, he withdrew from the talks on 10 February 1918, refusing to sign on Germany's harsh terms. After a brief hiatus, the Central Powers notified the Soviet government that they would no longer observe the truce after 17 February. At this point Lenin again argued that the Soviet government had done all it could to explain its position to Western workers and that it was time to accept the terms. Trotsky refused to support Lenin since he was waiting to see whether German workers would rebel and whether German soldiers would refuse to follow orders. Germany resumed military operations on 18 February. Within a day, it became clear that the German army was capable of conducting offensive operations and that Red Army detachments, which were relatively small, poorly organized and poorly led, were no match for it. On the evening of 18 February 1918, Trotsky and his supporters in the committee abstained, and Lenin's proposal was accepted 7-4. The Soviet government sent a radiogram to the German side, taking the final Brest-Litovsk peace terms. Germany did not respond for 3 days and continued its offensive, encountering little resistance. The response arrived on 21 February, but the proposed terms were so harsh that even Lenin briefly thought that the Soviet government had no choice but to fight. But in the end, the committee again voted 7-4 on 23 February 1918. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed on 3 March and ratified on 15 March 1918. Since Trotsky was so closely associated with the policy previously followed by the Soviet delegation at Brest-Litovsk, he resigned from his position as Commissar for Foreign Affairs to remove a potential obstacle to the new policy. Head of the Red Army. The failure of the recently formed Red Army to resist the German offensive in February 1918 revealed its weaknesses: insufficient numbers, lack of knowledgeable officers, and near absence of coordination and subordination. Celebrated and feared Baltic Fleet sailors, one of the bastions of the new regime led by Pavel Dybenko, fled from the German army at Narva. The notion that the Soviet state could have a capable voluntary or militia-type military was seriously undermined. Trotsky was one of the first Bolshevik leaders to recognize the problem, and he pushed for the formation of a military council of former Russian generals that would function as an advisory body. Lenin and the Bolshevik Central Committee agreed on 4 March to create the Supreme Military Council, headed by the former chief of the Imperial General Staff Mikhail Bonch-Bruvich. The entire Bolshevik leadership of the Red Army, including People's Commissar Nikolai Podvoisky and Commander-in-Chief Nikolai Krylenko, protested vigorously and eventually resigned. They believed that the Red Army should consist only of dedicated revolutionaries, rely on propaganda and force, and have elected officers. They viewed former imperial officers and generals as potential traitors who should be kept out of the new military, much less put in charge of it. Their views continued to be popular with many Bolsheviks throughout most of the Russian Civil War, and their supporters, including Podvoisky, who became one of Trotsky's deputies, were a constant thorn in Trotsky's side. The discontent with Trotsky's policies of strict discipline, conscription and reliance on carefully supervised non-communist military experts eventually led to the military opposition, which was active within the Communist Party in late 1918–1919. On 13 March 1918, Trotsky's resignation as Commissar for Foreign Affairs was officially accepted, and he was appointed People's Commissar of Army and Navy Affairs, in place of Podvoisky, and chairman of the Supreme Military Council. The post of Commander-in-Chief was abolished, and Trotsky gained full control of the Red Army, responsible only to the Communist Party leadership, whose left socialist revolutionary allies had left the government over Brest-Litovsk. With the help of his deputy Ephraim Skliansky, Trotsky spent the rest of the Civil War transforming the Red Army from a ragtag network of small and fiercely independent detachments into a large and disciplined military machine, through forced conscription, party-controlled blocking squads, compulsory obedience and officers chosen by the leadership instead of the rank and file. He defended these positions throughout his life. 1918. The military situation soon tested Trotsky's managerial and organization-building skills. In May to June 1918, the Czechoslovak legions en route from European Russia to Vladivostok rose against the Soviet government. This left the Bolsheviks with the loss of most of the country's territory, an increasingly well-organized resistance by Russian anti-communist forces and widespread defection by the military experts whom Trotsky relied on. Trotsky and the government responded with a full-fledged mobilization, which increased the size of the Red Army from fewer than 300,000 in May 1918 to 1 million in October, and an introduction of political commissars into the army. The latter had the task of ensuring the loyalty of military experts and co-signing their orders. Trotsky regarded the organization of the Red Army as built on the ideas of the October Revolution. As he later wrote in his autobiography, "An army cannot be built without reprisals. Masses of men cannot be led to death unless the army command has the death penalty in its arsenal. So long as those malicious tailless apes that are so proud of their technical achievements, the animals that we call men, will build armies and wage wars, the command will always be obliged to place the soldiers between the possible death in the front and the inevitable one in the rear. And yet armies are not built on fear. The Tsar's army fell to pieces not because of any lack of reprisals. In his attempt to save it by restoring the death penalty, Kerensky only finished it. Upon the ashes of the Great War, the Bolsheviks created a new army. These facts demand no explanation for anyone who has even the slightest knowledge of the language of history. The strongest cement in the new army was the ideas of the October Revolution, and the train supplied the front with this cement. In response to Fanya Kaplan's failed assassination of Lenin on 30 August 1918, and to the successful assassination of the Petrograd Cheka chief Moisei Aritsky on 17 August 1918, the Bolsheviks instructed Felix Dzerzhinsky to commence a Red Terror, announced in the 1 September 1918 issue of the Krasnaya Gazeta. Regarding the Red Terror, Trotsky wrote, "The bourgeoisie today is a falling class. We are forced to tear it off, to chop it away. The Red Terror is a weapon utilized against a class, doomed to destruction, which does not wish to perish. If the White Terror can only retard the historical rise of the proletariat, the Red Terror hastens the destruction of the bourgeoisie." In dealing with deserters, Trotsky often appealed to them politically, arousing them with the ideas of the revolution. In the provinces of Kaluga, Voronezh, and Ryazan, tens of thousands of young peasants had failed to answer the first recruiting summons by the Soviets. The War Commissariat of Ryazan succeeded in gathering in some 15,000 of such deserters. While passing through Ryazan, I decided to take a look at them. Some of our men tried to dissuade me. Something might happen, they warned me. But everything went off beautifully. The men were called out of their barracks. "Comrade deserters, come to the meeting. Comrade Trotsky has come to speak to you." They ran out excited, boisterous, as curious as schoolboys. I had imagined them much worse, and they had imagined me as more terrible. In a few minutes, I was surrounded by a huge crowd of unbridled, utterly undisciplined, but not at all hostile men. The comrade deserters were looking at me with such curiosity that it seemed as if their eyes would pop out of their heads. I climbed on a table there in the yard, and spoke to them for about an hour and a half. It was a most responsive audience. I tried to raise them in their own eyes. Concluding, I asked them to lift their hands in token of their loyalty to the revolution. The new ideas infected them before my very eyes. They were genuinely enthusiastic. They followed me to the automobile, devoured me with their eyes, not fearfully, as before, but rapturously, and shouted at the tops of their voices. They would hardly let me go. I learned afterward, with some pride, that one of the best ways to educate them was to remind them, "What did you promise Comrade Trotsky?" Later on, regiments of Ryazan, deserters, fought well at the fronts. Given the lack of manpower and the 16 opposing foreign armies, Trotsky also insisted on the use of former Tsarist officers as military specialists within the Red Army, in combination with Bolshevik political commissars to ensure the revolutionary nature of the Red Army. Lenin commented on this, "When Comrade Trotsky informed me recently that the number of officers of the old army employed by our War Department runs into several tens of thousands, I perceived concretely where the secret of using our enemy lay, how to compel those who had opposed communism to build it, how to build communism with the bricks which the capitalists had chosen to hurl against us. We have no other bricks. And so, we must compel the bourgeois experts, under the leadership of the proletariat, to build up our edifice with these bricks. This is what is difficult, but this is the pledge of victory." In September 1918, the Bolshevik government, facing continuous military difficulties, declared what amounted to martial law and reorganized the Red Army. The Supreme Military Council was abolished, and the position of commander-in-chief was restored, filled by the commander of the Latvian riflemen, Locum Vatsetis, who had formerly led the Eastern Front against the Czechoslovak legions. Vatsetis took charge of the day-to-day operations of the army. At the same time, Trotsky became chairman of the newly formed Revolutionary Military Council of the Republic and retained overall control of the military. Trotsky and Vatsetis had clashed earlier in 1918, while Vatsetis and Trotsky's advisor Mikhail Bonch-Bruvich were also on unfriendly terms. Nevertheless, Trotsky eventually established a working relationship with the often prickly Vatsetis. The reorganization caused yet another conflict between Trotsky and Stalin in late September. Trotsky appointed former Imperial General Pavel Pavlovich Sidin to command the Southern Front, but in early October 1918 Stalin refused to accept him and so he was recalled from the front. Lenin and Yakov Sverdlov tried to make Trotsky and Stalin reconcile, but their meeting proved unsuccessful. 1919. Throughout late 1918 and early 1919, there were a number of attacks on Trotsky's leadership of the Red Army, including veiled accusations in newspaper articles inspired by Stalin and a direct attack by the military opposition at the Eighth Party Congress in March 1919. On the surface, he weathered them successfully and was elected one of only 5 full members of the First Politburo after the Congress. But he later wrote, "It is no wonder that my military work created so many enemies for me. I did not look to the side, I elbowed away those who interfered with military success, or in the haste of the work trod on the toes of the unheeding and was too busy even to apologize." Some people remember such things. The dissatisfied and those whose feelings had been hurt found their way to Stalin or Zinoviev, for these two also nourished hurts. In mid-1919, the dissatisfied had an opportunity to mount a serious challenge to Trotsky's leadership. The Red Army grew from 800,000 to 3 million and fought simultaneously on 16 fronts. The Red Army had defeated the White Army's spring offensive in the east. It was about to cross the Ural Mountains and enter Siberia in pursuit of Admiral Alexander Kolchak's forces. But in the south, General Anton Denikin's White Russian forces advanced, and the situation deteriorated rapidly. On 6 June, Red Army Commander-in-Chief, Jukams Vasietis, ordered the Eastern Front to stop the offensive so that he could use its forces in the south. But the leadership of the Eastern Front, including its commander Sergei Kamenev, and Eastern Front Revolutionary Military Council members Ivar Smilga, Mikhail Lashevich and Sergei Gusev vigorously protested and wanted to keep the emphasis on the Eastern Front. They insisted that it was vital to capture Siberia before the onset of winter and that once Kolchak's forces were broken, many more divisions would be freed up for the Southern Front. Trotsky, who had earlier had conflicts with the leadership of the Eastern Front, including a temporary removal of Kamenev in May 1919, supported Vasiliev. At the 3 to 4 July Central Committee meeting, after a heated exchange, the majority supported Kamenev and Smilga against Vasiliev and Trotsky. Trotsky's plan was rejected, and he was much criticized for various alleged shortcomings in his leadership style, much of it of a personal nature. Stalin used this opportunity to pressure Lenin to dismiss Trotsky from his post. But when Trotsky offered his resignation on 5 July, the Politburo and the Orgburo of the Central Committee unanimously rejected it. However, some significant changes to the leadership of the Red Army were made. Trotsky was temporarily sent to the Southern Front, while Smilga informally coordinated the work in Moscow. Most members of the Revolutionary Military Council who were not involved in its day-to-day operations were relieved of their duties on 8 July, and new members, including Smilga, were added. The same day, while Trotsky was in the south, Vasiliev was suddenly arrested by the Cheka on suspicion of involvement in an anti-Soviet plot, and replaced by Sergei Kamenev. After a few weeks in the south, Trotsky returned to Moscow and resumed control of the Red Army. A year later, Smilga and Tukhachevsky were defeated during the Battle of Warsaw, but Trotsky refused this opportunity to pay Smilga back, which earned him Smilga's friendship and then supported during the intra-party battles of the 1920s. By October 1919, the government was in the worst crisis of the Civil War. Denikin's troops approached Tula and Moscow from the south, and General Nikolai Yudenik's troops approached Petrograd from the west. Lenin decided that since it was more important to defend Moscow, Petrograd would have to be abandoned. Trotsky argued that Petrograd needed to be defended, at least in part to prevent Estonia and Finland from intervening. In a rare reversal, Trotsky was supported by Stalin and Zinoviev, and prevailed against Lenin in the Central Committee. He immediately went to Petrograd, whose leadership headed by Zinoviev he found demoralized, and organized its defense, sometimes personally stopping fleeing soldiers. By the 22nd of October, the Red Army was on the offensive, and in early November, Yudenik's troops were driven back to Estonia, where they were disarmed and interned. Trotsky was awarded the Order of the Red Banner for his actions in Petrograd. 1920. With the defeat of Denikin and Yudenik in late 1919, the Soviet government's emphasis shifted to the economy. Trotsky spent the winter of 1919–20 in the Urals region trying to restart its economy. A false rumor of his assassination circulated in Germany and the international press on New Year's Day 1920. Based on his experiences, he proposed abandoning the policies of war communism, which included confiscating grain from peasants, and partially restoring the grain market. Still committed to war communism, Lenin rejected his proposal. He put Trotsky in charge of the country's railroads, which he directed should be militarized in the spirit of war communism. It was not until early 1921, due to economic collapse and social uprisings, that Lenin and the rest of the Bolshevik leadership abandoned war communism in favor of the new economic policy. In early 1920, Soviet-Polish tensions eventually led to the Polish-Soviet War. In the run-up and during the war, Trotsky argued that the Red Army was exhausted and the Soviet government should sign a peace treaty with Poland as soon as possible. He did not believe that the Red Army would find much support in Poland proper. Lenin later wrote that he and other Bolshevik leaders believed the Red Army's successes in the Russian Civil War and against the Poles meant, the defensive period of the war with worldwide imperialism was over, and we could, and had the obligation to, exploit the military situation to launch an offensive war. Poland defeated the Red Army, and the offensive was turned back during the Battle of Warsaw in August 1920, in part because of Stalin's failure to obey Trotsky's orders in the run-up to the decisive engagements. Back in Moscow, Trotsky again argued for a peace treaty, and this time prevailed. Trade union debate. In late 1920, after the Bolsheviks won the Civil War and before the 8th and 9th Congress of Soviets, the Communist Party had a heated and increasingly acrimonious debate over the role of trade unions in the Soviet Union. The discussion split the party into many platforms, including Lenin's, Trotsky's and Bukharin's. Bukharin eventually merged his with Trotsky's. Smaller, more radical factions like the Workers' Opposition and the Group of Democratic Centralism were particularly active. Trotsky's position formed while he led a special commission on the Soviet transportation system, Sektron. He was appointed there to rebuild the rail system ruined by the Civil War. Being the Commissar of War and a revolutionary military leader, he saw a need to create a militarized, production atmosphere, by incorporating trade unions directly into the state apparatus. His unyielding stance was that in a workers' state, the workers should have nothing to fear from the state, and the state should fully control the unions. In the Ninth Party Congress, he argued for a regime in which every worker feels himself a soldier of labor, who cannot dispose of himself freely. If the order is given to transfer him, he must carry it out. If he does not carry it out, he will be a deserter who is punished. Who looks after this? The trade unions. It creates the new regime. This is the militarization of the working class. Lenin sharply criticized Trotsky and accused him of bureaucratically nagging the trade unions, and of staging factional attacks. His view did not focus on state control as much as the concern that a new relationship was needed between the state and the rank-and-file workers. He said, introduction of genuine labor discipline is conceived only if the whole mass of participants in productions takes a conscious part in the fulfillment of these tasks. Bureaucratic methods and orders from above cannot achieve this. This was a debate that Lenin thought the party could not afford. His frustration with Trotsky was used by Stalin and Zinoviev with their support for Lenin's position, to improve their standing within the Bolshevik leadership at Trotsky's expense. Disagreements threatened to get out of hand, and many Bolsheviks, including Lenin, feared that the party would splinter. The Central Committee was split almost evenly between Lenin's and Trotsky's supporters, with all three secretaries of the Central Committee supporting Trotsky. At a meeting of his faction at the 10th Party Congress in March 1921, Lenin's faction won a decisive victory, and a number of Trotsky's supporters lost their leadership positions. Krestinsky was replaced as a member of the Politburo by Zinoviev, who had supported Lenin. Krestinsky's place in the Secretariat was taken by Vyacheslav Molotov. The Congress also adopted a secret resolution on party unity, which banned factions within the party except during pre-Congress discussions. The resolution was later published and used by Stalin against Trotsky and other opponents. At the end of the 10th Congress, after peace negotiations had failed, Trotsky gave the order for the suppression of the Kronstadt Rebellion, the last major revolt against Bolshevik rule. Years later, anarchist Emma Goldman and others criticized Trotsky's actions as Commissar for War for his role in the suppression of the rebellion, and argued that he ordered unjustified incarcerations and executions of political opponents such as anarchists, although Trotsky did not participate in the actual suppression. Some Trotskyists, most notably Abby Bakan, have argued that the claim that the Kronstadt rebels were counter-revolutionary has been supported by evidence of White Army and French government support for the Kronstadt-Sales March rebellion. Other historians, most notably Paul Avrich, claimed the evidence did not point towards this conclusion, and saw the Kronstadt rebellion as spontaneous. Trotsky's contribution to the Russian Revolution. Vladimir Chernyayev, a leading Russian historian, sums up Trotsky's main contributions to the Russian Revolution. Trotsky bears a great deal of responsibility both for the victory of the Red Army in the Civil War, and for the establishment of a one-party authoritarian state with its apparatus for ruthlessly suppressing dissent. He was an ideologist and practitioner of the Red Terror. He despised bourgeois democracy. He believed that spinelessness and soft-heartedness would destroy the revolution, and that the suppression of the propertied classes and political opponents would clear the historical arena for socialism. He was the initiator of concentration camps, compulsory, labor camps, and the militarization of labor, and the state takeover of trade unions. Trotsky was implicated in many practices which would become standard in the Stalin era, including summary executions. Historian Jeffrey Swain argues that The Bolsheviks triumphed in the Civil War because of Trotsky's ability to work with military specialists, because of the style of work he introduced where wide-scale consultation was followed through by swift and determined action. Lenin said in 1921 that Trotsky was, in love with organization, but in working politics, he has not got a clue. Swain explains the paradox by arguing that Trotsky was not good at teamwork. He was a loner who had mostly worked as a journalist, not as a professional revolutionary like the others. Lenin's illness. In late 1921, Lenin's health deteriorated and he was absent from Moscow for longer periods of time. He had 3 strokes between 25 May 1922 and 9 March 1923, which caused paralysis, loss of speech and finally death on 21 January 1924. With Lenin increasingly sidelined throughout 1922, Stalin was elevated to the newly created position of the Central Committee General Secretary. Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev became part of the troika formed by Stalin to ensure that Trotsky, publicly the number 2 man in the country and Lenin's heir presumptive, would not succeed Lenin. The rest of the recently expanded Politburo was at first uncommitted, but eventually joined the troika. Stalin's power of patronage in his capacity as General Secretary clearly played a role, but Trotsky and his supporters later concluded that a more fundamental reason was the process of slow bureaucratization of the Soviet regime once the extreme conditions of the Civil War were over. Much of the Bolshevik elite wanted normality, while Trotsky was personally and politically personified as representing a turbulent revolutionary period that they would much rather leave behind. Although the exact sequence of events is unclear, evidence suggests that at first the Troika nominated Trotsky to head second-rate government departments. In mid-July 1922, Kamenev wrote a letter to the recovering Lenin to the effect that, is throwing or is ready to throw a good cannon overboard. Lenin was shocked and responded, "Throwing Trotsky overboard? Surely you are hinting at that, it is impossible to interpret it otherwise, is the height of stupidity. If you do not consider me already hopelessly foolish, how can you think of that?" From then until his final stroke, Lenin spent much of his time trying to devise a way to prevent a split within the Communist Party leadership, which was reflected in Lenin's testament. As part of this effort, on the 11th of September 1922 Lenin proposed that Trotsky become his deputy at the Council of People's Commissars. The Politburo approved the proposal, but Trotsky categorically refused. In late 1922, Trotsky secured an alliance with Lenin against Stalin and the emerging Soviet bureaucracy. Stalin had recently engineered the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, further centralizing state control. The alliance proved effective on the issue of foreign trade but was hindered by Lenin's progressing illness. In January 1923, Lenin amended his testament to suggest that Stalin should be removed as the party's general secretary, while also mildly criticizing Trotsky and other Bolshevik leaders. The relationship between Stalin and Lenin had broken down completely by this time, as was demonstrated during an event where Stalin crudely insulted Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya. In March 1923, days before his third stroke, Lenin asked Trotsky to denounce Stalin and his so-called Great Russian Nationalistic Campaign, at the 12th Party Congress. At the 12th Party Congress in April 1923, however, just after Lenin's final stroke, Trotsky did not raise the issue. Instead, he made a speech about intra-party democracy while avoiding any direct confrontation of the Troika. Stalin had prepared for the Congress by replacing many local party delegates with those loyal to him, mostly at the expense of Zinoviev and Kamenev's backers. The delegates, most of whom were unaware of the divisions within the Politburo, gave Trotsky a standing ovation. This upset the Troika, already infuriated by Karl Radek's article, Leon Trotsky, Organizer of Victory, published in Pravda on 14 March 1923. Stalin delivered the key reports on organizational structure and questions of nationality, while Zinoviev delivered the Central Committee political report, traditionally Lenin's prerogative. Among the resolutions adopted by the 12th Congress were those calling for greater democracy within the party, but these were vague and remained unimplemented. In mid-1923 the Troika had Trotsky's friend and supporter Christian Rakovsky removed from his post as head of the Ukrainian government and sent to London as ambassador. When regional leaders in Ukraine protested against Rakovsky's reassignment, they too were reassigned to various posts all over the Soviet Union. Left opposition. Starting in mid-1923, the Soviet economy ran into significant difficulties, which led to numerous strikes countrywide. Two secret groups within the Communist Party, Workers' Truth, and Workers' Group, were uncovered and suppressed by the Soviet secret police. On 8 October 1923 Trotsky sent a letter to the Central Committee and the Central Control Commission, attributing these difficulties to lack of intra-party democracy. Trotsky wrote, "In the fiercest moment of war communism, the system of appointment within the party did not have 1/10 of the extent that it has now. Appointment of the secretaries of provincial committees is now the rule. That creates for the secretary a position essentially independent of the local organization. Opening square bracket .. Closing square bracket. The bureaucratization of the party apparatus has developed to unheard of proportions by means of the method of secretarial selection. Opening square bracket .. Closing square bracket. There has been created a very broad stratum of party workers, entering into the apparatus of the government of the party, who completely renounce their own party opinion, at least the open expression of it, as though assuming that the secretarial hierarchy is the apparatus which creates party opinion and party decisions. Beneath this stratum, abstaining from their own opinions, there lies the broad mass of the party, before whom every decision stands in the form of a summons or a command." Other senior communists who had similar concerns sent the Declaration of 46 to the Central Committee on 15 October, in which they wrote, "We observe an ever-progressing, barely disguised division of the party into a secretarial hierarchy and into laymen, into professional party functionaries, chosen from above, and the other party masses, who take no part in social life. Opening square bracket .. Closing square bracket. Free discussion within the party has virtually disappeared, party public opinion has been stifled. Opening square bracket .. Closing square bracket. It is the secretarial hierarchy, the party hierarchy which to an ever greater degree chooses the delegates to the conferences and congresses, which to an ever greater degree are becoming the executive conferences of this hierarchy." Although the text of these letters remained secret at the time, they had a significant effect on the party leadership and prompted a partial retreat by the Troika and its supporters on the issue of intra-party democracy, notably in Zinoviyev's Pravda article published on 7 November. Throughout November, the Troika tried to come up with a compromise to placate, or at least temporarily neutralize, Trotsky and his supporters. The first draft of the resolution was rejected by Trotsky, which led to the formation of a special group consisting of Stalin, Trotsky and Kamenev, which was charged with drafting a mutually acceptable compromise. On 5 December, the Politburo and the Central Control Commission unanimously adopted the group's final draft as its resolution. On 8 December, Trotsky published an open letter, in which he expounded on the recently adopted resolution's ideas. The Troika used his letter as an excuse to launch a campaign against Trotsky, accusing him of factionalism, setting the youth against the fundamental generation of old revolutionary Bolsheviks, and other sins. Trotsky defended his position in a series of 7 letters which were collected as the new course in January 1924. The illusion of a monolithic Bolshevik leadership was thus shattered and a lively intra-party discussion ensued, both in local party organizations and in the pages of Pravda. The discussion lasted most of December and January until the 13th Party Conference of the 16th to the 18th of January 1924. Those who opposed the Central Committee's position in the debate were thereafter referred to as members of the left opposition. Since the Troika controlled the party apparatus through Stalin's secretariat and Pravda through its editor Bukharin, it was able to direct the discussion and the process of delegate selection. Although Trotsky's position prevailed within the Red Army and Moscow universities and received about half the votes in the Moscow party organization, it was defeated elsewhere, and the conference was packed with pro-Troika delegates. In the end, only 3 delegates voted for Trotsky's position, and the conference denounced Trotskyism as a petty bourgeois deviation. After the conference, a number of Trotsky's supporters, especially in the Red Army's political directorate, were removed from leading positions or reassigned. Nonetheless, Trotsky kept all of his posts, and the Troika was careful to emphasize that the debate was limited to Trotsky's mistakes, and that removing Trotsky from the leadership was out of the question. In reality, Trotsky had already been cut off from the decision-making process. Immediately after the conference, Trotsky left for a Caucasian resort to recover from his prolonged illness. On his way, he learned about Lenin's death on 21 January 1924. He was about to return when a follow-up telegram from Stalin arrived, giving an incorrect date of the scheduled funeral, which would have made it impossible for Trotsky to return in time. Many commentators speculated after the fact that Trotsky's absence from Moscow in the days following Lenin's death contributed to his eventual loss to Stalin, although Trotsky generally discounted the significance of his absence. After Lenin's death, there was little overt political disagreement within the Soviet leadership throughout most of 1924. On the surface, Trotsky remained the most prominent and popular Bolshevik leader, although his mistakes were often alluded to by Troika partisans. Behind the scenes, he was completely cut off from the decision-making process. Politburo meetings were pure formalities since all key decisions were made ahead of time by the Troika and its supporters. Trotsky's control over the military was undermined by reassigning his deputy, Ephraim Skliansky, and appointing Mikhail Frunze, who was being groomed to take Trotsky's place. At the 13th Party Congress in May, Trotsky delivered a conciliatory speech. "None of us desires or is able to dispute the will of the party. Clearly, the party is always right. We can only be right with and by the party, for history has provided no other way of being in the right. The English have a saying, 'My country, right or wrong, whether it is in the right or in the wrong, it is my country.' We have much better historical justification in saying whether it is right or wrong in certain individual concrete cases, it is my party. And if the party adopts a decision which one or other of us thinks unjust, he will say, just or unjust, it is my party, and I shall support the consequences of the decision to the end." In the meantime, the left opposition, which had coagulated somewhat unexpectedly in late 1923 and lacked a definite platform aside from general dissatisfaction with the intra-party regime, began to crystallize. It lost some less dedicated members to the harassment by the Troika, but it also began formulating a program. Economically, the left opposition and its theoretician Yevgeny Preobrazhensky came out against further development of capitalist elements in the Soviet economy and in favor of faster industrialization. That put them at odds with Bukharin and Rykov, the right group within the party, who supported the Troika at the time. On the question of world revolution, Trotsky and Karl Radek saw a period of stability in Europe while Stalin and Zinoviev confidently predicted an acceleration of revolution in Western Europe in 1924. On the theoretical plane, Trotsky remained committed to the Bolshevik idea that the Soviet Union could not create a true socialist society in the absence of the world revolution, while Stalin gradually came up with a policy of building socialism in one country. These ideological divisions provided much of the intellectual basis for the political divide between Trotsky and the left opposition on the one hand and Stalin and his allies on the other. At the 13th Congress, Kamenev and Zinoviev helped Stalin diffuse Lenin's testament, which belatedly came to the surface. But just after the Congress, the Troika, always an alliance of convenience, showed signs of weakness. Stalin began making poorly veiled accusations about Zinoviev and Kamenev. Yet in October 1924, Trotsky published Lessons of October, an extensive summary of the events of the 1917 revolution. In it, he described Zinoviev's and Kamenev's opposition to the Bolshevik seizure of power in 1917, something that the two would have preferred be left unmentioned. This started a new round of intra-party struggle, which became known as the literary discussion, with Zinoviev and Kamenev again allied with Stalin against Trotsky. Their criticism of Trotsky was concentrated in three areas. Trotsky's disagreements and conflicts with Lenin and the Bolsheviks prior to 1917. Trotsky's alleged distortion of the events of 1917 in order to emphasize his role and diminish the roles played by other Bolsheviks. Trotsky's harsh treatment of his subordinates and other alleged mistakes during the Russian Civil War. Trotsky was again sick and unable to respond while his opponents mobilized all of their resources to denounce him. They succeeded in damaging his military reputation so much that he was forced to resign as People's Commissar of Army and Fleet Affairs and chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council on 6 January 1925. Zinoviev demanded Trotsky's expulsion from the Communist Party, but Stalin refused to go along and played the role of a moderate. Trotsky kept his Politburo seat, but was effectively put on probation. A year in the wilderness. For Trotsky, 1925 was a difficult year. After the bruising literary discussion and losing his Red Army posts, he was effectively unemployed throughout the winter and spring. In May 1925, he was given 3 posts: chairman of the Concessions Committee, head of the Electro-Technical Board, and chairman of the Scientific Technical Board of Industry. Trotsky wrote in My Life that he was taking a rest from politics, and naturally plunged into the new line of work up to my ears. Some contemporary accounts paint a picture of a remote and distracted man. Later in the year, Trotsky resigned his 2 technical positions and concentrated on his work in the Concessions Committee. In one of the few political developments that affected Trotsky in 1925, the circumstances of the controversy over Lenin's testament were described by American Marxist Max Eastman in his book Since Lenin Died. Trotsky denied this statements made by Eastman in an article he wrote. In the meantime, the Troika finally broke up. Bukharin and Rykov sided with Stalin while Krupskaya and Soviet Commissar of Finance Grigory Sokolnikov aligned with Zinoviev and Kamenev. The struggle became open at the September 1925 meeting of the Central Committee and came to a head at the 14-Party Congress in December 1925. With only the Leningrad Party organization behind them, Zinoviev and Kamenev, dubbed the New Opposition, were thoroughly defeated while Trotsky refused to get involved in the fight and did not speak at the Congress. United Opposition. In early 1926, Zinoviev, Kamenev and their supporters in the New Opposition gravitated closer to Trotsky's supporters, and the 2 groups soon formed an alliance, which also incorporated some smaller opposition groups within the Communist Party. The alliance became known as the United Opposition. The United Opposition was repeatedly threatened with sanctions by the Stalinist leadership of the Communist Party, and Trotsky had to agree to tactical retreats, mostly to preserve his alliance with Zinoviev and Kamenev. The opposition remained united against Stalin throughout 1926 and 1927, especially on the issue of the Chinese Revolution. The methods used by the Stalinists against the opposition became more and more extreme. At the 15-Party Conference in October 1926, Trotsky could barely speak because of interruptions and catcalls, and at the end of the conference he lost his Politburo seat. In 1927, Stalin started using the GPU to infiltrate and discredit the opposition. Rank-and-file oppositionists were increasingly harassed, sometimes expelled from the party and even arrested. Soviet policy toward the Chinese Revolution became the ideological line of demarcation between Stalin and the United Opposition. The Chinese Revolution began on 10 October 1911, resulting in the abdication of the Chinese Emperor, Puyi, on 12 February 1912. Sun Yat-sen established the Republic of China. In reality, however, the Republic controlled very little of the country. Much of China was divided between various regional warlords. The Republican government established a new, nationalist People's Army and a National People's Party, the Kuomintang. In 1920, the Kuomintang opened relations with Soviet Russia. With Soviet help, the Republic of China built up the Nationalist People's Army. With the development of the Nationalist Army, a northern expedition was planned to smash the power of the warlords of the northern part of the country. This northern expedition became a point of contention over foreign policy by Stalin and Trotsky. Stalin tried to persuade the small Chinese Communist Party to merge with the Kuomintang nationalists to bring about a bourgeois revolution before attempting to bring about a Soviet-style working-class revolution. Trotsky wanted the Communist Party to complete an orthodox proletarian revolution and have clear class independence from the KMT. Stalin funded the KMT during the expedition. Stalin countered Trotskyist criticism by making a secret speech in which he said that Chiang's right-wing Kuomintang were the only ones capable of defeating the imperialists, that Chiang Kai-shek had funding from the rich merchants, and that his forces were to be utilized until squeezed for all usefulness like a lemon before being discarded. However, Chiang quickly reversed the tables in the Shanghai massacre of 12 April 1927 by massacring the Communist Party in Shanghai midway through the Northern Expedition. While the catastrophic events in China completely vindicated Trotsky's criticism of Stalin's approach towards the Chinese Revolution, this paled in significance compared to the demoralization that the Soviet masses felt at such a big setback for socialist revolution in China, with this demoralization aiding Stalin and his allies in the Communist Party and the Soviet state. Attacks against the united opposition quickly increased in volatility and ferocity afterwards. Defeat and exile. In October 1927, Trotsky and Zinoviev were expelled from the Central Committee. When the united opposition tried to organize independent demonstrations commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Bolshevik seizure of power in November 1927, the demonstrators were dispersed by force and Trotsky and Zinoviev were expelled from the Communist Party on 12 November. Their leading supporters, from Kamenev down, were expelled in December 1927 by the 15-Party Congress, which paved the way for mass expulsions of rank-and-file oppositionists as well as internal exile of opposition leaders in early 1928. During this time Trotsky gave the eulogy at the funeral of his friend, the Soviet diplomat Adolf Joffe, in November 1927. It would be the last speech that Trotsky would give in the Soviet Union. When the 15-Party Congress made united opposition views incompatible with membership in the Communist Party, Zinoviev, Kamenev and their supporters capitulated and renounced their alliance with the left opposition. Trotsky and most of his followers, on the other hand, refused to surrender and stayed the course. Trotsky was exiled to Alma-Ata, Kazakhstan on 31 January 1928. He was expelled from the Soviet Union to Turkey in February 1929, accompanied by his wife Natalia Sadova and their eldest son, Lev. Fate of left oppositionists after Trotsky's exile. After Trotsky's expulsion from the Soviet Union, Trotskyists within the Soviet Union began to waver. Between 1929 and 1932, most leading members of the left opposition surrendered to Stalin, admitted their mistakes, and were reinstated in the Communist Party. One initial exception to this was Christian Rakovsky, who inspired Trotsky between 1929 and 1934 with his refusal to capitulate as state suppression of any remaining opposition to Stalin increased by the year. In late 1932, Rakovsky had failed with an attempt to flee the Soviet Union, and was exiled to Yakutia in March 1933. Answering Trotsky's request, the French mathematician and Trotskyist Jean van Heijenoort, together with his fellow activist Pierre Frank, unsuccessfully called on the influential Soviet author Maxim Gorky to intervene in favor of Christian Rakovsky, and boarded the ship he was traveling on near Constantinople. According to Heijenoort, they only managed to meet Gorky's son, Maxim Pashkov, who reportedly told them that his father was indisposed, but promised to pass on their request. Rakovsky was the last prominent Trotskyist to capitulate to Stalin in April 1934, when Rakovsky formally admitted his mistakes. Rakovsky was appointed to high office in the Commissariat for Health and allowed to return to Moscow, also serving as Soviet ambassador to Japan in 1935. However, Rakovsky was cited in allegations involving the killing of Sergei Kirov, and was arrested and imprisoned in late 1937, during the Great Purge. Almost all Trotskyists who were still within the Soviet Union's borders were executed in the Great Purges of 1936 to 1938, although Rakovsky survived until the Medvedev Forest Massacre of September 1941, where he was shot dead along with 156 other prisoners on Stalin's orders, less than 3 months into the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union. Also among the Medvedev Forest victims was Trotsky's sister, Kamenev's first wife, Olga Kameneva. Exile. In February 1929, Trotsky was deported from the Soviet Union to his new exile in Turkey. During his first 2 months in Turkey, Trotsky lived with his wife and eldest son at the Soviet Union consulate in Constantinople and then at a nearby hotel in the city. In April 1929, Trotsky, his wife and son were moved to the island of Bukata by the Turkish authorities. On Bukata, they were moved into a house called the Yanaros Mansion. During his exile in Turkey, Trotsky was under the surveillance of the Turkish police forces of Mustafa Kemal Pasha. Trotsky was also at risk from the many former White Army officers who lived on Prinkipo, officers who had opposed the October Revolution and who had been defeated by Trotsky and the Red Army in the Russian Civil War. However, Trotsky's European supporters volunteered to serve as bodyguards and assured his safety. In 1931, Trotsky wrote a letter to a friend titled, "What is Fascism?" to tell his friend that the Comintern was wrong to describe the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera as fascist, and to try to define fascism. On 20 February 1932, Trotsky and all of his family lost their Soviet citizenship and were forbidden to enter the Soviet Union. In 1932 he was hosted by the fascist regime in the Kingdom of Italy during a trip to Denmark. By the end of that same year Trotsky had joined a conspiratorial political bloc with the anti-Stalin opposition inside the USSR. There was no evidence of an alliance with Nazi Germany or Japan, as the Soviet Union claimed. The members of the bloc were Zinovievites, rightists and Trotskyists who capitulated to Stalin. Kamenev and Zinoviev also were members of the bloc. Trotsky wanted by no means that the alliance became a fusion, and he was afraid of the right gaining much power inside the bloc. Historian Pierre Brouet concluded that the bloc dissolved in early 1933, since some of its members like Zinoviev and Kamenev joined Stalin again, and because there were no letters in the Trotsky Harvard archive mentioning the bloc after 1932. In July 1933, Trotsky was offered asylum in France by Prime Minister Édouard Daladier. Trotsky accepted the offer, but he was forbidden to live in Paris and soon found himself under the surveillance of the French police. From July 1933 to February 1934, Trotsky and his wife lived in Royan. The philosopher and activist Simone Weil also arranged for Trotsky and his bodyguards to stay for a few days at her parents' house. Following the 6 February 1934 crisis in France, the French Minister of Internal Affairs, Albert Sarraut, signed a decree to deport Trotsky from France. However, no foreign government was found willing to accept Trotsky within its borders. Accordingly, the French authorities instructed Trotsky to move to a residence in the tiny village of Barbizon under the strict surveillance of the French police, where Trotsky found his contact with the outside world to be even worse than during his exile in Turkey. In May 1935, soon after the French government had agreed the Franco-Soviet Treaty of Mutual Assistance with the Soviet Union government, Trotsky was officially told that he was no longer welcome in France. After weighing his options, Trotsky applied to move to Norway. After obtaining permission from then Justice Minister Trygve Lie to enter the country, Trotsky and his wife became a guest of Konrad Knudsen at Norderhof, near Hönefoss, and spent over a year living at Knudsen's house. From 18 June 1935 to 2 September 1936, although Trotsky was hospitalized for a few weeks at the nearby Oslo Community Hospital from 19 September 1935. Following French media complaints about Trotsky's role in encouraging the mass strikes in France in May and June 1936 with his articles, the Johan Nygaardsvold-led Norwegian government began to exhibit disquiet about Trotsky's actions. In the summer of 1936, Trotsky's asylum was increasingly made a political issue by the fascist National Samling, led by Vidkun Quisling, along with an increase in pressure from the Soviet government on the Norwegian authorities. On 5 August 1936, Knudsen's house was burgled by fascists from the National Samling while Trotsky and his wife were out on a seashore trip with Knudsen and his wife. The fascist burglars targeted Trotsky's works and archives for vandalism. The raid was largely thwarted by Knudsen's daughter, Jordis, although the burglars did take a few papers from the nearest table as they left. Although the fascist perpetrators were caught and put on trial, the evidence obtained in the burglary was used by the government to make claims against Trotsky. On 14 August 1936, the Soviet press agency TASS announced the discovery of a Trotskyist Zinovievist plot and the imminent start of the trial of the 16 accused. Trotsky demanded a complete and open enquiry into Moscow's accusations. The accused were sentenced to death, including Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, and executed on 25 August 1936. On 26 August 1936, 8 policemen arrived at Knudsen's house demanding that Trotsky sign new conditions for residing in Norway. These conditions included agreeing to write no more about current political matters, to give no interviews, and to have all his correspondence inspected by the police. Trotsky categorically refused the conditions, and Trotsky was then told that he and his wife would soon be moved to another residence. The following day Trotsky was interrogated by the police about his political activities, with the police officially citing Trotsky as a «witness» to the fascist raid of 5 August 1936. On 2 September 1936, 4 weeks after the fascist break-in at Knudsen's house, Trygve Lie ordered that Trotsky and his wife be transferred to a farm in Hurum, where they were under house arrest. The treatment of Trotsky and his wife at Hurum was harsh, as they were forced to stay indoors for 22 hours per day under the constant guard of 13 policemen, with only 1 hour permitted twice a day for a walk on the farm. Trotsky was prevented from posting any letters and prevented from arguing back against his critics in Norway and beyond. Only Trotsky's lawyers and the Norwegian Labour Party parliamentary leader, Olav Scheflo, were permitted to visit. From October 1936, even the outdoor walks were prohibited for Trotsky and his wife. Trotsky did eventually manage to smuggle out one letter on 18 December 1936, titled The Moscow Confessions. On 19 December 1936, Trotsky and his wife were deported from Norway after being put on the Norwegian oil tanker Ruth, under guard by Jonas Lie. When later living in Mexico, Trotsky was utterly scathing about the treatment he received during his 108 days at Hurum, and accused the Norwegian government of trying to prevent him from publicly voicing his strong opposition to the trial of the 16 and other show trials, saying, "When I look back today on this period of internment, I must say that never, anywhere, in the course of my entire life, and I have lived through many things, was I persecuted with as much miserable cynicism as I was by the Norwegian, socialist, government. For 4 months, these ministers, dripping with democratic hypocrisy, gripped me in a stranglehold to prevent me from protesting the greatest crime history may ever know." The Ruth arrived in Mexico on 9 January 1937. On Trotsky's arrival, the Mexican president, Lázaro Cárdenas, welcomed Trotsky to Mexico and arranged for his special train the Hidalgo to bring Trotsky to Mexico City from the port of Tampico. From January 1937 to April 1939, Trotsky and his wife lived in the Coyoacán area of Mexico City at La Casa Azul, the home of the painter Diego Rivera and Rivera's wife and fellow painter, Frida Kahlo, with whom Trotsky had an affair. His final move was a few blocks away to a residence on Avenida Vienna in April 1939, following a break with Rivera. Trotsky wrote prolifically while in exile, penning several key works, including his History of the Russian Revolution and the Revolution Betrayed, a critique of the Soviet Union under Stalinism. He argued that the Soviet state had become a degenerated workers' state, controlled by an undemocratic bureaucracy, which would eventually either be overthrown via a political revolution establishing a workers' democracy, or degenerate into a capitalist class. While in Mexico, Trotsky also worked closely with James P. Cannon, Joseph Hansen, and Farrell Dobbs of the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States, and other supporters. Cannon, a longtime leading member of the American Communist movement, had supported Trotsky in the struggle against Stalinism since he had first read Trotsky's criticisms of the Soviet Union in 1928. Trotsky's critique of the Stalinist regime, though banned, was distributed to leaders of the Comintern. Among his other supporters was Chen Dushou, founder of the Chinese Communist Party. While in Mexico, Trotsky worked with André Breton and Diego Rivera to write the Manifesto for an Independent Revolutionary Art, which inspired the creation of the organization, the International Federation of Independent Revolutionary Art in 1938. This organization was short-lived and ended before 1940. An attempt to re-establish the organization was made in the 1960s by a group called Rupture founded by Pascal Collard, Monique Charbonnel, and Jean-Claude Charbonnel. Moscow show trials. In August 1936, the first Moscow show trial of the so-called Trotskyite Zinovievite terrorist center was staged in front of an international audience. During the trial, Zinoviev, Kamenev and 14 other accused, most of them prominent old Bolsheviks, confessed to having plotted with Trotsky to kill Stalin and other members of the Soviet leadership. The court found everybody guilty and sentenced the defendants to death, Trotsky in absentia. The second show trial of Karl Radek, Grigory Sokolnikov, Yuri Pyatokov and 14 others, took place in January 1937, during which more alleged conspiracies and crimes were linked to Trotsky. In April 1937, an independent commission of inquiry into the charges made against Trotsky and others at the Moscow trials was held in Koyakon, with John Dewey as chairman. The findings were published in the book, Not Guilty. The Moscow trials are perpetuated under the banner of socialism. We will not concede this banner to the masters of falsehood. If our generation happens to be too weak to establish socialism over the earth, we will hand the spotless banner down to our children. The struggle which is in the offing transcends by far the importance of individuals, factions and parties. It is the struggle for the future of all mankind. It will be severe, it will be lengthy. Whoever seeks physical comfort and spiritual calm, let him step aside. In time of reaction it is more convenient to lean on the bureaucracy than on the truth. But all those for whom the word, socialism, is not a hollow sound but the content of their moral life, forward. Neither threats nor persecutions nor violations can stop us. Be it even over our bleaching bones, the future will triumph. We will blaze the trail for it. It will conquer. Under all the severe blows of fate, I shall be happy as in the best days of my youth. Because, my friends, the highest human happiness is not the exploitation of the present but the preparation of the future. Fourth International. For fear of splitting the communist movement, Trotsky initially opposed the idea of establishing parallel communist parties or a parallel international communist organization that would compete with the Third International. In mid-1933, after the Nazi takeover in Germany and the Comintern's response to it, he changed his mind. He said, "An organization which was not roused by the thunder of fascism and which submits docilely to such outrageous acts of the bureaucracy demonstrates thereby that it is dead and that nothing can ever revive it. In all our subsequent work it is necessary to take as our point of departure the historical collapse of the official Communist International." In 1938, Trotsky and his supporters founded the Fourth International, which was intended to be a revolutionary and internationalist alternative to the Stalinist Comintern. Dies Committee. Towards the end of 1939, Trotsky agreed to go to the United States to appear as a witness before the Dies Committee of the House of Representatives, a forerunner of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Representative Martin Dies, chairman of the committee, demanded the suppression of the American Communist Party. Trotsky intended to use the forum to expose the NKVD's activities against him and his followers. He made it clear that he also intended to argue against the suppression of the American Communist Party and to use the committee as a platform for a call to transform World War II into a world revolution. Many of his supporters argued against his appearance. When the committee learned the nature of the testimony Trotsky intended to present, it refused to hear him, and he was denied a visa to enter the United States. On hearing about it, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union immediately accused Trotsky of being in the pay of the oil magnates and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Final months. After quarreling with Diego Rivera, Trotsky moved to his final residence on Avenida Vienna in April 1939. On 27 February 1940, Trotsky wrote a document known as Trotsky's Testament, in which he expressed his final thoughts and feelings for posterity. He was suffering from high blood pressure, and feared that he would suffer a cerebral hemorrhage. After forcefully denying Stalin's accusations that he had betrayed the working class, he thanked his friends and above all his wife, Natalia Sadova, for their loyal support. In addition to the happiness of being a fighter for the cause of socialism, fate gave me the happiness of being her husband. During the almost 40 years of our life together she remained an inexhaustible source of love, magnanimity, and tenderness. She underwent great sufferings, especially in the last period of our lives. But I find some comfort in the fact that she also knew days of happiness. For 43 years of my conscious life I have remained a revolutionist, for 42 of them I have fought under the banner of Marxism. If I had to begin all over again I would of course try to avoid this or that mistake, but the main course of my life would remain unchanged. I shall die a proletarian revolutionist, a Marxist, a dialectical materialist, and, consequently, an irreconcilable atheist. My faith in the communist future of mankind is not less ardent, indeed it is firmer today, than it was in the days of my youth. Natasha has just come up to the window from the courtyard and opened it wider so that the air may enter more freely into my room. I can see the bright green strip of grass beneath the wall, and the clear blue sky above the wall, and sunlight everywhere. Life is beautiful. Let the future generations cleanse it of all evil, oppression and violence, and enjoy it to the full. L. Trotsky, the 27th of February 1940, Koyakon. Assassination. After a failed attempt to have Trotsky murdered in March 1939, Stalin assigned the overall organization of implementing the task to the NKVD officer Pavel Sudoplatov, who, in turn, co-opted Nahum Eitingen. According to Sudopletov's special tasks, the NKVD proceeded to set up 3 NKVD agent networks to carry out the murder. According to Sudopletov, all 3 networks were designed to operate entirely autonomously from the NKVD's hitherto established spy networks in the US and Mexico. On 24 May 1940, Trotsky survived a raid on his villa by armed assassins led by the NKVD agent Iosif Grigulovich and Mexican painter David Alfaro Siqueiros. Trotsky's 14-year-old grandson, Vsevolod Platonovich, Esteban, Volkov, was shot in the foot, and a young assistant and bodyguard of Trotsky, Robert Sheldon Hart, was abducted and later murdered. Trotsky's other guards fended off the attackers. Following the failed assassination attempt, Trotsky wrote an article titled, "Stalin Seeks My Death," on 8 June 1940, in which he stated that another assassination attempt was certain. On 20 August 1940, Trotsky was attacked in his study by Spanish-born NKVD agent Ramon Mercader, who used an ice axe as a weapon. A mountaineering ice axe has a narrow end, called the pick, and a flat wide end called the adze. The adze of the axe wounded Trotsky, fracturing his parietal bone and penetrating 7 centimeters into his brain. The blow to his head was bungled and failed to kill Trotsky instantly. Witnesses stated that Trotsky spat on Mercader and began struggling fiercely with him, which resulted in Mercader's hand being broken. Hearing the commotion, Trotsky's bodyguards burst into the room and nearly beat Mercader to death, but Trotsky stopped them, laboriously stating that the assassin should be made to answer questions. Trotsky was then taken to a hospital and operated on, surviving for more than a day, but dying, at the age of 60, on 21 August 1940 from exsanguination and shock. Mercader later testified at his trial, "I laid my raincoat on the table in such a way as to be able to remove the ice axe which was in the pocket. I decided not to miss the wonderful opportunity that presented itself. The moment Trotsky began reading the article, he gave me my chance. I took out the ice axe from the raincoat, gripped it in my hand and, with my eyes closed, dealt him a terrible blow on the head." According to James P. Cannon, the secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party, Trotsky's last words were, "I will not survive this attack." Stalin has finally accomplished the task he attempted unsuccessfully before. Mercader was tried and convicted of the murder and spent the next 20 years in a Mexican prison. Stalin presented Mercader with an order of Lenin in absentia. Legacy. Trotsky's house in Koyakon has been preserved in much the same condition as it was on the day he was assassinated there, and is now the Leon Trotsky Museum in Mexico City, run by a board which includes his grandson Esteban Volkov. Trotsky's grave is located on its grounds. The foundation, International Friends of the Leon Trotsky Museum, has been organized to raise funds to improve the museum further. Trotsky was never formally rehabilitated during the rule of the Soviet government, despite the Glasnost-era rehabilitation of most other old Bolsheviks killed during the Great Purges. His son, Sergei Sadov, who died in 1937, was rehabilitated in 1988, as was Nikolai Bukharin. Beginning in 1989, Trotsky's books, forbidden until 1987, were published in the Soviet Union. Trotsky was rehabilitated on 16 June 2001 by the General Prosecutor's Office. Contributions to Marxist theory. Trotsky considered himself to be a Bolshevik-Leninist, arguing for the establishment of a vanguard party. He viewed himself as an advocate of orthodox Marxism. His politics differed in some respects from those of Stalin or Mao Zedong, most importantly in his rejection of the theory of socialism in one country and his declaring of the need for an international, permanent revolution. Numerous Fourth Internationalist groups around the world continue to describe themselves as Trotskyists and see themselves as standing in this tradition. However, they have different interpretations of the conclusions to be drawn from this. Supporters of the Fourth International echo Trotsky's opposition to Stalinist totalitarianism, advocating political revolution, and arguing that socialism cannot sustain itself without democracy. Permanent revolution. Permanent revolution is the theory that the bourgeois democratic tasks in countries with delayed bourgeois democratic development can only be accomplished through the establishment of a workers' state, and that the creation of a workers' state would inevitably involve inroads against capitalist property. Thus, the accomplishment of bourgeois democratic tasks passes over into proletarian tasks. Although most closely associated with Leon Trotsky, the call for permanent revolution is first found in the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in March 1850, in the aftermath of the 1848 revolution, in their address of the Central Committee to the Communist League. It is our interest and our task to make the revolution permanent until all the more or less propertied classes have been driven from their ruling positions, until the proletariat has conquered state power and until the association of the proletarians has progressed sufficiently far, not only in one country but in all the leading countries of the world, that competition between the proletarians of these countries ceases and at least the decisive forces of production are concentrated in the hands of the workers. Their battle cry must be, the permanent revolution. Trotsky's conception of the permanent revolution is based on his understanding, drawing on the work of the founder of Russian Marxism Georgy Plekhanov, that in backward countries the tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution could not be achieved by the bourgeoisie itself. Trotsky first developed this conception in collaboration with Alexander Parvus in late 1904–1905. The relevant articles were later collected in Trotsky's books 1905 and in Permanent Revolution, which also contains his essay, Results and Prospects. Some Trotskyists have argued that the state of the Third World shows that capitalism offers no way forward for underdeveloped countries, thus again proving the central tenet of the theory. The United Front. Trotsky was a central figure in the Comintern during its first four congresses. During this time, he helped to generalize the strategy and tactics of the Bolsheviks to newly formed communist parties across Europe and further afield. From 1921 onwards, the United Front, a method of uniting revolutionaries and reformists in the common struggle while winning some of the workers to revolution, was the central tactic put forward by the Comintern after the defeat of the German Revolution. After he was exiled and politically marginalized by Stalinism, Trotsky continued to argue for a united front against fascism in Germany and Spain. According to Joseph Chunera of the British Socialist Workers' Party in International Socialism, his articles on the United Front represent an essential part of his political legacy. External links. Leon Trotsky at the Encyclopaedia Britannica. Trotsky speaks about the Moscow trials on YouTube. Trotsky in Havana by Dmitry Prieto from Havana Times. 65 years since Trotsky's death, an essay by Rob Sewell. FBI records relating to Trotsky's murder. Ice pick that killed Trotsky, found in Mexico which is stained with his blood. Dossier on Trotsky, International Viewpoint. January 2006 Images of Trotsky House, Mexico City. Lenin and Trotsky, What They Really Stood For by Alan Woods and Ted Grant. The Contradiction of Trotsky by Claude Lefort. The Leon Trotsky Internet Archive at Marxists.org. 1. Uncommon Knowledge interview with Christopher Hitchens and Robert Service on Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky, Jews on the Left, video lecture by Dr. Henry Abramson. Lev Davidovich Trotsky, International Left Opposition Archives at the International Institute of Social History. Newspaper clippings about Leon Trotsky in the 20th Century Press Archives of the ZBW. 2. An historical presentation of the party state that replaced the Soviets. How We Made the October Revolution, by Leon Trotsky, NY Times, 1919. Max Shachtman Correspondence with Leon Trotsky. General Collection of Rare Books and Manuscripts. Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. Thanks for listening to Wiki-On-Tape. I hope you drop by again sometime. Goodbye.